But as far as this week and next week, we're going to talk about 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And to me, this is the Bible nerd Michael coming out. This is fascinating to me. Number one, because unless you're in a setting like this, or have a very boring pastor on Sunday mornings, the average church person, unless you've been to seminary or, taken some, biblical literature classes in college, aren't aware of these things. We don't really study it this close. We don't pick it up. It's a lot to go through when you go through 1st and 2nd Kings, and then you go into 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Well, if you can make it through the first 9 chapters of Chronicles, which is tough in and of itself, then you get to chapter 10 of Chronicles, and you're like, I've already read this before, so I don't need to read it again. And most people just skip over 1st and 2nd Chronicles because they just see it as a repeat of what they've already read in Samuel and Kings. But there's a lot different that we find in these two, and that's primarily what we're going to focus on today is the differences in Samuel and Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So I've titled this 1st Chronicles, Here We Go Again, and I should have added, but not really, because it's the same, but it's very different. And to me, that's what I find, for me personally, so fascinating about Scripture. We had a professor come speak to us many years ago, and he talked about, I think he was talking about church growth. It had nothing to do with biblical literature per se, but it was really church growth. And he said it takes 2 wings to fly. I'll never forget that statement. He said it takes the spiritual and the practical. He says it takes prayer and it takes preparation. Some people just want to focus all on the spiritual. Some people all just want to focus all on the natural. He said, but it takes 2 wings to fly. He used the example of Jesus. Jesus was 100% God, but 100% man. So there was his divinity, but his humanity. But in that, it was not conflicting. It was perfect together, and it displayed this perfect picture of Christ. And the Scriptures are the same way. Growing up, in Sunday school and even beyond that, this is the Bible, it's God's Word, it's perfect, just read it and do what it says. And then you find out, as we've seen, there's a lot in the Bible. It's not as neat as we've been told it is, because there's a lot of messy stuff in here. There's a lot of bad stuff in here. We've gone through some of the stuff they didn't teach us growing up, and it's like, oh wow, some of these stories are violent and gruesome, and that's why we're talking about the Bible for grown-ups. But to me, as I've gotten older, I find it so fascinating. So yes, the Bible is 100% God's Word, given to us. It's inspired by God. It's God's revelation to us, but it's also a very human book, because you see the humanity of the writers come through. You see the historical times that they're living and writing in come through. You see the different perspectives that the different writers have come through. You see the different intentions that the writers have come through, and we'll see that today especially. You can write the same story from a different perspective, and use that story for a different purpose than maybe somebody else used that story. Same story, same truth, but you're telling it in a way to get a different spiritual point across. And that's what we see here. So you see the humanity in the telling of the history of Israel here as well. So hopefully share some of that. And we've been on this journey for a while, and some Christians can't handle that. I can't have some of these conversations with my wife, because she's like, if I read it here and read it there, it should be the same. There should be no difference, and it just frustrates her to no end. But to me, I'm like, I find this fascinating. I just want to know more, and it makes me dig into the Scriptures more and more. So let's just talk about some of this and find out what's going on here and how the same events can mean two different things and have two different emphasis to different groups of people. So, conflicting history. It doesn't take long when reading 1st and 2nd Chronicles to come to two conclusions. Number one, the first conclusion is, I've read all this before. This is nothing new. Second, but there are a lot of differences from what I read before. So basically what we have is two different histories of Israel. You have 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, which in the Hebrew Bible, there's just Samuel and Kings. There's no division. So you have Samuel and Kings. That's one history of the kings of Israel. Then you have 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which goes over much of the same story as Samuel and Kings, but it's different. And so in our box here, we have these two histories of Israel. 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and then 1st and 2nd Chronicles. 1st and 2nd Samuel begins, and will probably just say Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, just for the sake of not having to say 1st and 2nd all the time. But Samuel and Kings begins with the prophet Samuel. And Chronicles begins with 9 chapters of genealogies, beginning with Adam. So if that's not how you would write a compelling book, starting with 9 chapters of genealogies, but there's a reason that there are those genealogies. We'll talk about that later. Both Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles tell the story of Saul, the first king of Israel. Both of them tell the story of David, King David. They also tell the story of Solomon. However, those stories are told very differently between Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. In Samuel and Kings, we have the histories of the divided kingdoms. You remember it lists the kings of the northern kingdom, it lists the kings of the southern kingdom. Sometimes it alternated between the kings, and you don't know if you're in the north or the south. You don't know where you are because it's given these histories of both kings. In Chronicles, it's primarily focused on the kings of Judah. Primarily focused on the kings of Judah. We end Kings talking about the exile, how God's people have gone into exile. In Chronicles, it details the exile, but also the return from exile. So God sent the kingdom of Judah off into Babylonian exile, but it was only for about 70 years. And then the decree went forth from the Persian king that they could come back to Israel and live in their land, rebuild their temple, rebuild their city. And so Chronicles covers that return from exile back to the land. Now, when you pick up in Ezra and Nehemiah, that's when we talk about the specific rebuilding of Jerusalem. So these are the two histories of Israel. Covers the same but has different emphasis. But there's differences. First of all, let's talk about the stories of David and Solomon. Here's what you'll find and what you won't find. In Samuel, we'll find the famous stories of David and Bathsheba. That's one of David's most famous stories we talk about. David and Bathsheba commits adultery, beyond adultery, seizes Bathsheba, forces himself on her, has her husband killed. Not a good look, David. Chronicles, it's as if it never happened. It is not there. You will not find the story of David and Bathsheba in Chronicles. You won't find any stories that make David look bad or show David's weaknesses in Chronicles. It's not there. Solomon, as wise as Solomon was, you remember we spent a whole lesson talking about Solomon's wisdom that turned to foolishness. Solomon multiplied wives, multiplied horses, had so much power, and then got into idolatry himself. You won't find that in Chronicles. You won't find his foreign wives. You won't find his foreign weddings. You won't find his idolatry. It's not there in Chronicles. Not there. Then we have a transition of power. If you remember, David was an old man, stricken in years. You remember he was laying in his bed and he couldn't get warm. And remember they laid a woman with him and he's just so pitiful. And then his son tries to usurp his authority, and you have his generals following David's son. And there's this power struggle, and Bathsheba wants Solomon to take the throne because David has already told Solomon he's going to take the throne. So you have Bathsheba and Solomon versus David's other son, and there's this conflict and this war between whose allegiance, are you going to follow David's, I think it was Adonijah, and then you have Solomon, and it's this great conflict surrounding the passing off of power between David and Solomon. Not in Chronicles. Smooth as butter. Smooth as butter. David, not feeble. David says, "Here's the kingdom, Solomon." And everybody says, and Solomon says, "Thank you for the kingdom, Father." And everybody just rallies around Solomon and everybody's happy. No intrigue, no usurping the throne, no conflict. It's smooth transition in the Chronicles. You don't find it. Then we come with the temple. The temple. You remember David was not allowed to build the temple, so God used Solomon to build the temple. Well, in both Samuel, Kings, and in Chronicles, that's true. David's not allowed to build the temple. Solomon builds the temple. However, in Chronicles, David does everything but build the temple. He plans the temple, he prepares the temple, he gets the men to build the temple, he does fundraisers for the temple, he collects materials for the temple. David does everything except build the temple. So there's several chapters. I think it's at least 6 or 7 chapters in Chronicles where David's doing all this preparation for the temple. That does not happen in Kings. So David plays a much greater role in preparing the temple in Chronicles than he does in Kings. So in the stories of David and Solomon, you see there's all these differences. Another major difference you'll see is in the divided kingdom. Where's the northern kingdom in Chronicles? It's not there. The only time the northern kingdom is mentioned is if there happens to be something related to a southern king. Chronicles is not concerned about the northern kingdom. Primarily because Judah, the southern kingdom, is the one that survived the exile. And because Chronicles isn't concerned about the northern kingdom, you won't find Elijah and Elisha in the book of Chronicles. As great of a role they played in Kings, especially Elisha, you won't find it there because they primarily dealt with the northern kingdom. So I've read this before, but it's very different from what we've read before. You could say Chronicles was maybe trying to clean up what happened in Kings. But are they doing it in a deceptive way, thinking, hey, nobody's going to know about this? Of course not. So the writer of Chronicles is well aware of the stories in Samuel and Kings. He uses much of the material from Samuel and Kings. He's not trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes. He knows people in Israel know about David and Bathsheba. He knows that people in Israel know about Solomon's corruption. He's not trying to trick anybody. He's not trying to fool anybody. So why is it so different? Well, as we have down here, the when explains the why. When these histories of Israel were written explains why they're written in the ways that they were. And as we've mentioned before, Samuel and Kings was written while Israel was in exile in Babylon. When they were carried off in the Babylonian captivity, it was written and updated shortly after the return to land, but it was written primarily to those in exile to answer the question, how did we get here? How did we end up in Babylonian exile when we thought God was with us? What did we do to deserve this? We've talked about this before. So therefore, here's what you did to deserve it. Here's how we got in this trouble. Starting with David, or starting with Saul, starting with David. Actually, before that, we see Samuel in the priesthood, there, and then you see Saul, and then you see David, Solomon's corruption, and then what happens there, and the war and the fighting, and so it doesn't leave any details out. It tells the history, warts and all, to say, this is how we displeased God. This is how God got angry with us. This is how we got in this mess. So, Samuel and Kings was written primarily during the time in exile. Chronicles, on the other hand, was written about 200 years later, after Israel had been back in the land for several generations. So between Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, there's hundreds of years in between the writings. I know they're back to back in our Bible, so it's not like they wrote Samuel and Kings and turned right around and wrote Chronicles. This has been generations after. There's a lot of time. So in the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible, Chronicles is the last book in the Hebrew Bible, separated well away from Samuel and Kings. It's the very last book, retelling the history of Israel for a different generation, in a different time, for a different purpose. So, written 200 years after Israel had been back in the land, the central concern and question for Chronicles is, after all this time, are we still God's people? Has God abandoned us? And do we have a future? Do we have a future? And really, who are we as a people? Chronicles is a book of identity. That's why it starts with genealogies. That's why it starts with Adam, to show us we're God's people from the very beginning. And this is our identity. I know we don't have a Davidic king on the throne. I know we don't have the glory of the temple of Solomon anymore. But that doesn't mean God has left us, because God has a future for us. God's given us a promise through David that a perfect king would come, that he would restore the fortunes and the glory of Israel. So it's a book to establish the identity of Israel and to show them we are still God's people and we have promises. So it seeks to encourage Judah to keep the faith. So it's basically a sermon and encouragement to the people. Not to answer how do we get in this mess, but to answer, do we have a future? Does God still have promises for us? And the answer in Chronicles is yes. God does have future and promises. So therefore, the purpose of Chronicles is threefold. It's to show a renewed hope for the future. It's to show a renewed Davidic monarchy. Why? Because that's where the Messiah would come through. And it's to show a renewed commitment to the covenant through the priesthood and the temple. So, when these books were written and who they were written to tells us why these differences. This explains why Samuel and Kings doesn't hesitate to highlight the flaws and fallen leadership of David, Solomon, and every other king. Bad leadership was one of the main reasons Israel was divided and got carted off into captivity. In Chronicles, the flaws of these leaders are glossed over. They're idolized. They're kingly models or blueprints for a hopeful future. Basically, in telling the story of David, without his flaws is saying, this is what our future king is going to be like. And telling the story of Solomon without his downfall is saying, this is what our future king will be like. We'll talk in a few minutes about Manasseh. Manasseh, Chronicles uses him as a blueprint of God restoring his people and still God being central in their nation. So it's presenting these kings not because they were perfect, because they weren't. Not trying to pull the wool over everybody's eyes and say, oh, that didn't happen with David and Bathsheba. But in order to say, this is what a true king of Israel looks like. This is what true leadership, this is what a true priesthood looks like for the future. This is the hope that we have. So this is how these books go back and they function in the ancient world. These books, Chronicles, don't function primarily as a book of data, but a theology book that tells a religious narrative to the people of Israel to encourage faithfulness to the covenant, not to give up hope. So really our misunderstandings, when you see something different in Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, we think they're the same books written for the same purpose to tell us perfect history, perfect data, and all of this. And then when Chronicles says something different, that's when the critics of the Bible attack the Bible and say, see, you can't trust the Bible. Chronicles that can't even agree with Kings. There's contradictions all over the Bible. And so therefore, the Bible can't be trusted, the Bible can't be true. So then you've got to have books this thick written by people coming up with solutions to why these things don't agree with each other. And some books and Christians are bent on making everything line up perfectly. They don't, because they weren't supposed to, because that's not the purpose of them. Because antiquity didn't think like we think. The Jewish writers weren't thinking, let me just write down historical data and that's it. No, they're trying to write down a message to their people about them and their God. And they're using this history as the foundation to preach to the people about their relationship with God. That's the purpose of it. But we have this expectation and we force it on the text that the original writer never intended to as well. He knew about David and Bathsheba. He wasn't trying to trick anybody or fool anybody, but he was looking ahead instead of looking behind. The writer of Samuel and Kings was looking behind, saying what went wrong. The writer of Chronicles is looking ahead, saying here's what can be right with us as a people. So when these books were written tell us why they are so different. So on the back of page 1, I've listed just some notable differences. Now another thing you'll find in Chronicles and Samuel Kings is numbers are a problem. If you're trying to, line up, if you take every number and line them up, you're going to find some differences. Some of this is attributed to scribal differences because, the Bible wasn't taken and put on a copier. It had to be handwritten year after year after year for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And so you will find discrepancies in some of the numbers, some of the details. I didn't put all this in your paper. I didn't think it was noteworthy. I'll just mention a few. In 2 Samuel 24, a census was taken. There was 800,000 in Israel. 1 Chronicles 21 tells us there was 1.1 million in Israel. There's a difference in those numbers. In 1 Kings chapter 4, we're told Solomon had 40,000 horses. In 2 Chronicles, we're told he had 4,000 horses. Solomon had 3,300 foremen in 1 Kings 5, 3,600 in 2 Chronicles chapter 2. The two pillars in the temple in 1 Kings 7 were 18 cubits high. Second Chronicles, they were 35 cubits high. So you'll find discrepancies between the two. And most Bibles, in fact, ones I went in and looked in kind of correct these, but put some manuscripts have this number, some manuscripts have this number. 1 Kings 9, Solomon had 550 overseers, and 2 Chronicles, he had 250 overseers. Ahaziah was either 22 when he came to the throne, or he was 42. Depends on if you're reading Kings or Chronicles. Asa did not remove the high places, or he did remove the high places. So you'll find these small variations between these two. But there are some other differences that may be a little more, and I wrote some of these down. First of all, when it comes to the Davidic prophecy, whose house, whose temple is it? In 2 Samuel chapter 7, and this may seem slight, but there is a difference. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 16, talking about the prophecy of David's prophecy and Solomon coming in, he's specifically saying, your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. So he's speaking specifically to David and Solomon, your house, your kingdom. In 1 Chronicles, the wording through the prophet is different. I will set him over my house and my kingdom forever. So it goes from Samuel being your house, David and Solomon, to now being my house and my kingdom forever. To show that even though David and Solomon aren't around anymore, God's temple and God's kingdom are still around, because ultimately it's God's temple. Ultimately it's God's kingdom. So you have the same conversation from the same prophet, but the wording is different because it's conveying a different idea. Solomon's temple was destroyed. Solomon's kingdom was destroyed. But God has a future temple and a future kingdom to bring forth. Therefore, it's established forever. So Chronicles is trying to get a point across that ultimately this is God's. We're God's people. This is God's temple. This is God's kingdom. Another, will God punish or will he not punish? Again, speaking to David and David's prophecy about Solomon, I will be his father, he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him. So I took it away from Saul, whom I removed before you. 1 Chronicles 17, same prophecy. I will be his father, he will be my son. I will never take my love away from him as I took it from your predecessor. The chronicler leaves out the threat of punishment. Same prophecy, but he leaves out the threat of punishment. Number one, because they've already been punished. But number two, he's thinking the idol, the perfect king that's coming. God won't have to punish him because he'll be perfect, because he'll fulfill the ideal that God has for Israel. God will not need to punish him. So there's no punishment threat here. Who incited David to number Israel? In 2 Samuel, it was the Lord. And the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, go and take a census. 1 Chronicles 21 says Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census. So who incited David to take a census? Did Yahweh or did Satan? Well, according to Kings and Chronicles, according to Samuel and Kings, it was the Lord. According to Chronicles, it was Satan. And there's all kind of ideas of, why it's different. Manasseh. Now, Manasseh was a horrible king. Horrible king. In fact, Manasseh was the reason that God said, I'm going to send you off into exile. You are so horrible. You cause the people to sin so much. I'm going to send you off to exile. Let's hear what 2 Kings 21 says about Manasseh. But they did not listen, and Manasseh led them astray to do more evil than the nations had done, who the Lord destroyed before the people of Israel. And the Lord said by his servants the prophets, because Manasseh, king of Judah, has committed these abominations and done things more evil than all the Amorites did who were before him, and has made Judah also to sin with his idols. And therefore says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I am bringing upon Jerusalem and Judah such disaster that the ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. Then he says in verse 16, moreover, Manasseh shed very much innocent blood till he had filled Jerusalem from one end to the other, besides the sin that he made Judah to sin, so that they all did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And then Manasseh dies. So Manasseh led them astray to do more evil than all the other nations. God says, I'm going to send them away because of that. And Manasseh shed so much blood, it filled all of Jerusalem. And then he dies. Chronicles, we find something totally different that happens to Manasseh. Totally different. In 2 Chronicles 22, it says, Manasseh led Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem astray to do more evil than the nations who the Lord destroyed before the people of Israel. That's what we just read. The Lord spoke to Manasseh and to his people, but they paid no attention. Therefore the Lord brought commanders to the kings of Assyria, who captured Manasseh with hooks and bound him with chains of bronze and brought him to Babylon. And when he was in distress, he entreated the favor of the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. He prayed to him, and God was moved by his entreaty and heard his plea and brought him again to Jerusalem into his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. Verse 15, Manasseh took away the foreign gods and the idols from the house of the Lord. And he took away all the altars that he had built on the mountain of the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, and he threw them outside the city. He restored the altar of the Lord before and offered on it sacrifices and peace offerings and thanksgiving offerings. And he commanded Judah to serve the Lord, the God of Israel. Huh? What? What? It's like Kings and Chronicles, he does nothing right at all. After God says, I'm going to judge you, Manasseh fills the city with blood. Here, after Manasseh does evil and God punishes them, Manasseh's carried off to Babylon. But then he comes back and is restored as king again and leads a great revival. His heart turns to God. He tears down the idols. He builds up the altars. He sacrifices to God. He commands Judah to serve the Lord. He leads a great revival. What? Either the writer of Kings totally missed that. What's going on? And then he dies after leading this great revival. What happens? Chronicles has a different agenda. This is what a king does. This story here that's added in Chronicles, it could have happened. Many people think that, this is what happened, it's just not written in Kings. Many people think that this was just added. But if you notice, it's kind of teaches a lesson. It talks about a wicked king that was carried off into Babylon, who's allowed to come back to Jerusalem and become faithful to God again. What's happening in Judah? They were unfaithful. They were carried off to Babylon. They were allowed to come back to Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, and have the opportunity to become faithful to God again. What the writer of Chronicles, regardless of the historical facts, what he's doing is he's showing this is the nation of Judah. This is Israel. This is a microcosm of Israel. It's showing how it's supposed to be. Yes, you sin. Yes, you were carried off into captivity, but God's going to bring you back. And you need to be faithful to God. Just like the worst king was allowed to come back and be faithful to God. It's a theological lesson. It's a theological lesson encouraging the people to faithfulness. That's the point of it. I don't get bent out of shape that story's not told exactly the same in both, because I understand why it's there. It's written to encourage the people, now that they're back in the land, to be faithful to God. To be faithful to God. How many sons did Jesse have? Here's another discrepancy. Was there 7 sons, as Chronicles says, or was there 8 sons, as Kings says? And there's a lot of speculation of why that's different there as well. Many people speculated there was a son that died. The Bible doesn't tell us that, but there was 8 sons in Samuel, and there's 7 sons. 7 is also the number of completion, the number of perfection, maybe showing David as, and the future Messiah, as the perfect and complete king as well. Because it's all teaching us something theological. So there's all the differences. That's not all the differences. There's more. But that's a portion to show you're reading the same thing, but not really. I'm not going to go through all this on the overview in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. We've basically talked about it. It's the final book of the Hebrew Bible, placed at the very end to kind of summarize and give hope for the people of Israel. In our Bible, it's placed after Kings, and Ezra and Nehemiah follow it. It's more chronological in our Bible, because you have the return to exile, and then you have Ezra and Nehemiah that come after that. That's rebuilding the city, so you kind of pick up on the history there. The key ideas, the 1st and 2nd Chronicles, again, is a retelling of the past in order to inspire hope in the present, leading to the future. That's what you see. It's not meant to be a purely historical record. It's meant to be a writing that retells the history, that shapes it to have hope for the future and the ideal for Israel. The reigns of David and Solomon are idealized. The centrality of temple worship, whereas I think there's 5 chapters in Samuel and Kings about the temple, there's double that in Chronicles. The building of the temple is more of a central focus. The validation of the priests and Levites as leaders as community leaders. You find, even in the genealogies, you'll find more time spent in Judah and Levi than others, because Messiah and priesthood, Messiah and temple, are 2 major themes in Chronicles. Messiah and temple. The purpose, again, is to retell the story. It's a sermon-like narrative. It's a theology of hope for the Hebrew community after the exile and trying to find their identity, trying to find out who they are, trying to find out if God has left them, trying to find out if there's a future and a hope and a king that's coming for them, as God promised. God's presence is important, more important than a king's presence. In fact, another thing that Chronicles leaves out is, we're talking about the wisdom of Solomon, the Queen of Sheba, and the thing where the ladies brought the child to Solomon. Chronicles isn't concerned with any of those things about Solomon. Most thing that Chronicles is concerned about is the building of the temple surrounding David and Solomon. So Chronicles isn't concerned with even their kingly functions. Chronicles is concerned with religious worship, because that's what they're trying to reestablish in Israel during the time of the writing of Chronicles, the centrality of worship and the temple. Sources, there are numerous sources that the writer of Chronicles uses. He uses, of course, the law, and he uses, obviously, Samuel and Kings as a guide, but there are so many other outside sources that he uses from different books, from different histories, from different records. Many of them are mentioned in Chronicles, so he compiles all these sources together. And then when you look at Chronicles as a whole, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, there are 3 major parts. The first part in Chronicles is chapters 1 through 9, and these are the genealogies. which, we tend to skip over when reading. But for them, it was very important because it gave them identity. One of the things, in 2020, when we found ourselves with a lot more time on our hands than we do now, I find myself, for some reason, getting an Ancestry.com account and going through my family lineage and heritage. I figured, hey, might as well. Why not? And intriguing. It's intriguing because you want to know where you come from. You want to know who came before you. What's your identity? What's your heritage? That's what's going on here in Chronicles. It's written to tell the people, you have an identity. And it goes all the way back to Adam. And it goes through Abraham. And it goes through Jacob, Israel. And it goes through the tribes. This is who you are as a people. You're not abandoned. This is your identity. It's your heritage. And that's what he does that for. That's why there's 9 chapters of genealogies. The chronicler takes the line all the way back to Adam, while concentrating finally on Judah and the Levites, because that's where his main interest is. Judah, king, Levites, priest and temple, and worship. The 2 main focuses. Part 2 starts in 1 Chronicles 10 and goes all the way to 2 Chronicles 9. And this tells the story of the united monarchy, the united kingdom under David and Solomon. This section that is longer by some pages than the rest of the story, from Rehoboam to the exile, because David and Solomon are the focus. Why? Because David and Solomon were who the promises were made to of a future king. So that's why there's so much time taken with them. That's why their sins are glossed over, because the focus really isn't on them; it's on the future Messiah that would come through them. 1 Chronicles 10 through 21 tells the story of David alone. 1 Chronicles 22 through 29 introduces Solomon for the purpose of the construction of the temple. Again, and it's in 2 Chronicles 23 through 29 that we don't have in Kings and Samuel. It talks about David's preparing the temple and doing everything for the temple. 2 Chronicles picks up the story of Solomon alone, who actually does the building of the temple. So in Chronicles, again, David does everything for the temple except build it. The temple and correct worship is the focus of this section. More than half of David's story is concerned with the preparations, and over 2/3 of Solomon's with its construction dedication. So again, the stories of David and Solomon in Chronicles really revolves around the temple. Because for the community coming back to Israel, that's what's important to the chronicler. Getting worship back right. Getting our worship to Yahweh back right. Being faithful to the covenant. So David and Solomon are used there to point toward the important thing in their day, rebuilding the temple and restoring worship. So there's a point to the story. And then the third part of Chronicles, 2 Chronicles 10 through 36 relates the story of Judah only. During the period of the divided monarchy, there's also a further pattern. Success in battle and material prosperity are related directly to obedience to God, while failure is due to lack of trust or unfaithfulness to God. So again, being faithful to covenant is prosperity and protection. Breaking covenant leads to destruction. The story includes the exile, but the story of Chronicles ends with the edict of Cyrus, king of Persia, who in fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy was appointed by God to build a temple for him at Jerusalem. And therefore he invites the people to go up to Jerusalem and to build the temple and to go back and restore the temple. And so we end Chronicles on the note of restoration. Restoration. And here on the back, I won't read through this, but this is just kind of a guide to give you as you're reading 1 Chronicles. And next week we'll do an outline of 2 Chronicles. But here you see again the major divisions, the genealogies from Adam to David, and then the stories about David. So that's really your two divisions of First Chronicles. Genealogies, all about David. And what you'll find there, his anointing and his reign. The really only sinful thing here is the census that's taken. But again, that's attributed to Satan's temptation that causes him to do that. And then from 22 down through 29, that's new material about the temple. You don't find that in Samuel and Kings. So that's new material when David is doing all the work, preparing the temple. And that's how we end that. So fascinating stuff to me. It may not mean much to anybody, but fascinating to show. So that way, if it happens, somebody comes up to you on the street and says, hey, Chronicles contradicts Samuel and Kings, and it's all a mess. And you can be like, here's the real story, Yeah. Here, have something to read. And but the main point to see is that these books are written not just to tell us historical facts. It's to teach us theological lessons. Well, not really teach us, but to teach them who are living it about theological lessons and their covenant with God. How they got into the mess, and then what the future holds for them as well. And when you have that perspective, there's no conflict at all in that. So the fact that, Manasseh's story is different in both doesn't shake my faith in the Bible. Knowing what I know about the Bible, it actually enhances my faith in it. Because I can see the point that the writer was trying to make to the people of their day about their future. And don't lose hope, because God still has a great future for you. God still has, and then so they had their idolized perfect version of the Messiah, and then Jesus comes and he totally changes, who the Messiah is going to be as well. So it'll get flipped upside down again when Jesus comes on the scene. And so that's just the interesting fact. So that's the difference between Chronicles and Samuel and Kings. Any questions?